There's something comforting about diners. The cozy atmosphere, the smell of food, the familiar faces. Sometimes behind the comfort lies something much darker. In today's video, I'm sharing 4 horrifying diner horror stories that will make you think twice before sitting down at your favorite booth. A late-night visitor. Our first story takes place at a small 24-hour diner that was known for attracting all sorts of people late at night. It wasn't in the best part of town, but it had its regulars. Most of the staff were used to odd customers, drunk, tired, or just passing through. One night, a waitress, let's call her Lisa, was working the night shift. It was around 2 a.m. The diner was mostly empty. The door opened and a man walked in. Tall, with a pale face and dark, messy hair. He wore an old coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. Lisa greeted him as usual, and he sat at the same booth he always did, in the far corner by the window. Didn't say much, never did. Just ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, like he had done every night for the past week. But something about him always made Lisa uncomfortable. He never looked at her when she took his order, and he had this strange habit of staring out the window, even though it was pitch black outside. Each night, he stayed for hours, talking to anyone, just staring, drinking his coffee. Lisa tried not to think too much about it. After all, late-night customers could be a little odd sometimes. Then, one night, and stopped showing up. For days, Lisa kept looking at the door, expecting him to walk in at any moment. But he never did. She thought maybe he had moved on and another place to haunt. A few days later, Lisa was reading the morning paper when something caught her eye. It was the man. His face was on the front page. Headline read, "Suspect in brutal murder still at large." Lisa's heart sank. She looked closer at the picture. It's him, no doubt about it. The same man she had served for a week straight, night after night. The same man who had sat silently in that corner booth, staring out the window. The worst part, the article said the murder had happened just a few blocks from the diner. Suddenly, all those nights when he sat in silence, staring out the window, made sense. He wasn't just lost in thought, he was hiding from what he had done. Lisa couldn't believe it. She had been serving coffee and pie to a murderer, sitting just a few feet away from him, night after night, never knowing. Next time she worked the night shift, that booth in the corner, it never felt the same again. The forgotten plate. In our next story, late-night dish becomes a haunting reminder that not all customers are as they seem. This story takes place in a small-town diner, kind where everyone knows each other, and the regulars rarely miss a day. The quiet place, especially late at night. Most of the time, the only people there were truckers passing through or locals grabbing a late bite after a long day. One night, around 11 p.m., a man walked in. Ordinary enough, 40s, tired and a little worn out. Kind of guy you'd expect to see on a long road trip. Down at a booth near the back and placed a simple order, a burger, fries, coffee. The waitress had seen her fair share of late-night customers, nothing of it. Brought him his food, and he thanked her with a small nod. That was the last time she spoke to him. For the next half hour, the man just sat there, staring down at his plate. Didn't touch his food, not a single bite. Coffee sat there, cooling, untouched. Then, without warning, he stood up, a few dollars on the table, and walked out of the diner. The waitress noticed he hadn't even paid the full bill. It was late. Feared he'd just forgotten in a rush. People do that sometimes. She cleared his table, but something about the untouched plate stuck with her. It was almost as if he had never been there. Life in the diner went on, and soon night passed without incident. Next morning, however, everything changed. The same waitress came into work. There, on the front page of the local paper, was the man's face. Bold letters across the top read, "The man missing under mysterious circumstances." The man who had been sitting in that very booth, staring at his untouched plate, had been reported missing. He hadn't gone home after leaving the diner. No one had seen him since. Days went by. The police came by the diner asking if anyone had seen him. Staff mentioned the strange encounter, but there wasn't much to tell. No one knew where he had gone after that night. Then, about a week later, something even more bizarre happened. The waitress came in for her shift to find that same booth, one where the man had sat, wasn't quite empty. There, sitting on the table, was a plate, burger, fries, and a coffee. No one had ordered it. No one had sat there. And yet, food was exactly as she had left it that night. Untouched, old, forgotten. Staff was puzzled. They hadn't prepared that dish, and no customer had been there long enough to place such an order. It was as if the man had returned, leaving behind the only clue that something wasn't right. The plate was cleared once again, but from that day on, the booth seemed different. People avoided it, and the late-night staff couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something still sitting there, watching. And every once in a while, on quiet nights when the diner was nearly empty, the waitress would glance at that booth, swear she saw a plate of food sitting there, waiting for its owner to return. The vanishing waitress. This next story is about a diner in a small town where the staff started noticing something strange. It all started when one of the regular waitresses, let's call her Emily, disappeared. Emily had worked at the diner for years, was well liked by the staff, customers, just about everyone in town. Had a friendly smile, knew everyone's usual order, and could make anyone feel at home. Then one day, Emily didn't show up for her shift. First, people thought she had just taken the day off or maybe fallen ill. As the hours passed and no one could get in touch with her, concerns started to grow. She wasn't the type to just vanish without a word. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and her apartment was empty. No one had seen her leave, and no one knew where she went. It turned into weeks, and Emily's absence weighed heavily on the diner. Some of the staff even started to feel uncomfortable being there at night. There was this eerie silence, as if the place knew something was wrong. Then odd things started happening. At first, it was little stuff, kind of things you could easily dismiss. Plates would shift on their own. Silverware would go missing and then reappear in the strangest places. The door to the break room would open by itself, even when it had been locked. It wasn't just the staff who noticed. Customers began to feel it too. Some regulars swore they could hear someone whispering their names, even when no one was near them. Others said they felt a sudden cold breeze, despite the warm summer nights. Then came the sightings. Started with one of the night cooks. He was closing up when he saw someone standing by the front window, thinking it was a late-night customer to tell them they were closed. But as he approached, froze. Figure at the window looked like Emily, who was standing there in her uniform, staring out into the parking lot as if she were waiting for someone. When the cook stepped closer, she was gone, vanished, like she had weeks before. First, he didn't believe what he saw, chalked it up to exhaustion. But when he mentioned it to the other staff, he admitted they had seen her too. Sometimes it was just a glimpse, shadow in the corner, figure moving through the kitchen. Times was clearer, like she was right there with them. Strangest part was always in her uniform. It was as if, even in death, or whatever this was, Emily couldn't leave the diner behind. Staff tried to move on, but the sightings became more frequent. Customers began to avoid the diner after dark, and the few who stayed late claimed they could feel someone watching them, even when they were the only ones there. It got so bad that some employees refused to work the night shift. They said they couldn't handle the whispers, moving plates, the cold spots that seemed to follow them around. Then, one night, the diner owner decided to stay late, determined to figure out what was happening. He sat in the empty diner, watching the shadows, waiting for any sign of Emily. Just as he was about to give up and leave, he heard it. Faint, familiar voice. It was Emily, calling his name. Slowly, he turned to the booth where she used to sit on her breaks. And there she was, just for a moment, looking right at him, as if she wanted to say something. But before he could react, she was gone again. The owner never spoke about that night, but he made a quiet decision. Placed Emily's uniform, and she had left behind, a fresh one, and hung it in the back room. Kept her name on the schedule, though she'd never return. And ever since, the diner has been quieter. The strange occurrences haven't stopped completely. They've become less frequent. Almost as if Emily is finally at peace, or at least as close to peace as she can get, still lingering in the place she called home. Midnight shift. Sometimes working the midnight shift comes with more than just tired eyes. Our fourth story brings us to a diner that held a dark secret. It was a small, run-down diner off the highway. The kind of place that never really closed. Most of the day it was quiet. Midnight shift was especially eerie. Customers came through at that hour. The occasional trucker or someone on a long road trip. One night, a young cook named Sam was working the midnight shift. He had just started at the diner a few weeks ago, filling in for the night cook who had suddenly quit. Sam didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he liked it. Customers meant fewer dishes, more time to relax. Soon after he started, strange things began to happen. It started with small noises, pots clanging in the kitchen, even when no one was back there. At first, Sam figured it was just old pipes or the usual creaks of an aging building, but as the nights went on, noises became harder to ignore. One night, at 2 a.m., Sam was cleaning up when he heard the sound of footsteps coming from the kitchen. Hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was the only one there. Cautiously, he went to check. When he stepped into the kitchen, it was empty, a single soul in sight. Brushing it off as his mind playing tricks, Sam went back to work. The next night, it happened again. This time, he heard whispering, faint. Someone speaking just out of earshot. But there was no one else there. Started to feel uneasy. The diner was always a bit creepy at night, but this felt different. Noises were too clear, too intentional. He mentioned it to one of the waitresses who worked the early morning shift. He gave him a strange look. "You didn't hear about the old night cook, did you?" she asked. Sam shook his head. "No, what about him?" Leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They found him dead in the kitchen about 5 years ago. Heart attack, they said. But here's the thing. He was found at 3 a.m., sharp, middle of making an order. Since then, strange things have been happening during the midnight shift. It's why nobody sticks around for long." Sam felt a chill run down his spine, tried to laugh it off. A look in the waitress's eyes told him she wasn't joking. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The diner felt colder, the air heavier. He kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes to 3 a.m. Then it happened. Exactly 3 a.m., the lights in the kitchen flickered. Sam froze. Hear the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen, plates clinking, a knife scraping against a cutting board. Slowly, crept toward the kitchen door and peeked inside. There, standing in front of the stove, the figure. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but Sam could see it clearly. A man in a cook's uniform standing exactly where the old night cook had died. Sam's heart raced, blinked, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. Panicking, Sam grabbed his things and left the diner without looking back. He never returned for his next shift. In fact, never went near that diner again. The midnight shift continued. Strange occurrences never stopped. Every new cook who took the job would eventually quit, all with the same story. Voices in the kitchen, strange figures, and a presence that seemed to linger around 3 a.m. To this day, one knows why the spirit of the old night cook can't seem to leave. Perhaps he's still trying to finish that last order, forever in the kitchen where he took his final breath.